at friend-to-friend nudges to or reminders to vote, and the causal effect that those had in the 2018 midterm elections. Prior to that, I was doing my PhD on in a computer science department, but I was working on international relations data of the kind a certain country takes an action to another country over time, and I was developing models for that kind of data.
Okay, I guess I'll go next. I'm Bob Shapiro. I'm the one person in the room who's been at Columbia for the longest time, since 1982. And so you can do the arithmetic there. No, I specialize in American politics. I teach courses and do research on public opinion, political behavior, political leadership, the mass media, things like that. I have a specialization in survey research methods, problems and surveys, things of that sort. My involvement in elections, well, as sort of a consumer and a teacher about elections and public opinion, in terms of direct contact with elections. I guess the most direct contact I ever had in an election was when for a few years I was an exit poll consultant for ABC News for a few elections. So I know the ins and outs of exit polls, how they're used when they come in, what their problems are. I can attest to the fact that the exit polls are not used very heavily in projecting winners of the election, particularly in battleground states. And I'd be happy to talk about those kinds of things, with respect to the 2020 polling and election.
I guess that leaves me. Hi, I'm Professor Warrow. I do American politics with a specialization on the US Congress. So my focus is mainly congressional elections. I've written on congressional elections and campaign finance. In terms of direct election involvement, I'm a pretty consistent voter. I haven't done any major consulting, but I do give, I lecture frequently to non-practitioners about how to understand elections and how to understand broader dynamics and cycles in American electoral politics.
Great, thank you so much for those introductions. So our first question is actually about one of the main issues of this election, of the pandemic, of course. And so our first question is, out of respect for the social distancing protocol, the Biden campaign has leaned away from in-person campaigning and almost exclusively employed virtual voter mobilization tactics. Dr. Schein, you've studied how friend-to-friend texting is emerging as a new and more effective way of voter mobilization. Do you think this tactic is sustainable even post-COVID, when campaigns will likely resume in-person campaigning?
Yeah, definitely. It really emerged in 2018 before the pandemic. So the Vote Joe app, which is the app that you would use to text your friends to remind them to vote for Joe Biden, that was built on top of Outvote, which is an app that came out in 2018 and is what we studied in this study. I mean, it seems to work very well. So that said, friend-to-friend tactics are not a replacement for more traditional tactics like door-to-door and phone banking. I mean, they work very well if you can actually contact people with them, but they're they're a very powerful weapon, but they're hard to wield, right? So it's much more difficult to target specific voters with friend-to-friend tactics. To do that, you need to know the friends of the voters you're trying to target, and they need to be willing volunteers, right? So it's not a replacement for having campaign volunteers that contact people they don't know, but it'll be around for elections to come. Yeah.
Do our other speakers have any thoughts on that, or do you want to move on?
Yeah, I mean, the big question here is, how is the use of social media effective and influential in that regard, in contrast to other things that are going on, like with respect to this and how much the effect is. For example, in this current election, we have, I think I think it's safe to say we have a pretty extraordinary, turnout in the current election. And I think that the factors, producing that go far beyond the use of social media. There's just a whole lot of other things going on and at work here. And to disentangle the effects of social media is very difficult. Although, and maybe Aaron Schein might have some insight on this, with respect to generational differences and different people of different age groups in terms of the effects. That may be the real question, and I could actually see the case where that could be much more important and effective among younger voters. But again, there's and it may not have an overarching effect on the current mobilization of voters, but over time that kind of thing could have an effect, because if it's generational, it means it might continue as these people grow older as well.
Yeah, I mean, and in the data, so it does look like the data skews younger. I mean, as you would expect, younger people are using outvote, and it's also the case that users are texting their friends who are, again, of similar age to them. So moreover, the tactic works best on people that don't vote as frequently, which also tend to skew younger. So whether that's an artifact of just that it's a new technology that's being adopted right now by younger people, or whether it is something that's sort of inherently generational as a tactic, we don't know.
I mean, in the current context, when the campaigns have said everybody should go out and vote and tell 6 friends, it becomes easy to tell six friends if it's simply a matter of using social media or texting them or something like that. And and it's the convenience of that comes into play here, because you don't have to pick up the phone or anything like that. It's just you've got your phone on you and you just do it.
Yeah, and I should add that the extra bit that these apps give you beyond sort of encouraging you is that they display to you information about your phone contacts that are taken from the public voter rolls. So when you're browsing through your contacts on these apps, you see next to the contact names, this person is registered in this state, this person is registered Democrat, Republican, this person is a super voter in previous elections or an infrequent voter. And so, instead of just sort of thinking of 6 people randomly, you can be a little bit more systematic. It's still convenient. You're still sitting on your couch, but you can find the 5 people that are in a swing state and need a reminder, right? And you can send the text.
Research shows that one of the most effective ways to get people to vote is to let them know that their vote, whether they vote, is public or not, and to basically just make that apparent, and that people can find out if they want to find out. So as apps make it more transparent who votes and who doesn't vote, I think it, at least we don't know, there's not research that is specific to the apps, but we know that through other kinds of experimental research, field experiments, that basically that proves to be a pretty effective way to get people to vote, is to you're sort of, I don't know if the right word is shaming, but you're sort of providing transparency about their voting behavior, and that can lead people to engage in voting behavior they wouldn't normally do.
There's experiments that compare, you tell someone that their voter history is public, and you either have them feel proud about it. So you tell them, hey, you voted in the half of the last elections, good for you. Or you tell them, or you shame them, oh, you only voted in half of the last elections, right? And it works better when you shame them, is the conclusion of that experiment. But I think they both increase voter turnout. So
yeah, all very interesting points about like social media and shaming people for voting. Along the lines of the question being about the pandemic, we're also wondering, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused far more voters to vote by mail this year. Do you think we will know the results of the election tonight? And if not, when do you think we will?
Yeah, let me just jump in on that. There's been a lot of talk about mail-in votes coming in late or being counted late. And what's going on now is that you've got these early votes and mail votes coming in. Each state handles it in different ways, But if you look at the what the AP reports of the vote, these votes are really being processed. And if I asked you the question, what of the proportion of mail vote requests that were made in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and if I asked you to tell me, what proportion of those have been mailed and accepted already, would you tell me 50%? Would you tell me 20%? Would you tell me 80%? Which one of those numbers is right? Well, it's rhetorical. It's 80%. So the word got out that people should mail things early, or if not mail them in, drop them off at drop-in boxes. And so the controversy that may come into play with regard to mail votes coming in a day or two after the election may be limited to just a couple of locations. And of course, the locations we're talking about are, Pennsylvania, maybe North Carolina, and so forth. So I don't think there's a bigger issue. It could be the case, especially given the fact that, given the long lines that have occurred related to the pandemic, and then the consolidation of voting precincts. I think a lot of people now have an incentive to request mail ballots and either mail them in or just drop them off on election day. At your regular voting place. They've been accepted. Well, some states will accept them right there, and that was the case in New York today.
Okay, yeah, so that makes sense as far as kind of our like pandemic related questions go. Kind of shifting gears a little bit. I know a lot of people are thinking that, I don't know, I think everyone's thinking a little bit at least about how 2016 went. And I think there's kind of this widespread notion that polling data somehow failed to correctly predict the 2016 election. So kind of what are everyone's thoughts on that? And how maybe have polling methodologies shifted to more accurately gauge today's presidential election results? Like, what did we learn from 2016?
Well, I'll chime in, since I said I study these kinds of things. What happened in 2016 was that the national polls were basically, within 1% of the of Hillary Clinton's margin of victory in the popular vote, which obviously was completely irrelevant to the election. But that figure, in a sense, perhaps vindicates polling in general, and particularly polling just on public opinion, where as needed you can statistically weight data to a known population, like based on census data or the American Community Survey or something like that. So to say that the election basically showed that all polling is bad is completely wrong. However, the state polls were off, and the state polls actually look pretty similar to what they were, at least if you look at Real Clear Politics. The state polls look pretty similar in 2020 as they did in 2016, where it looked close, and it was thought the states would break toward Hillary Clinton. But the problem in the state polls, and this was found after the fact, if you want to read about the study, the major study that was done, it was done by the American Association for Public Opinion Research. They had a task force that was actually ready to study the election polls, but they turned into a damage control task force. And what they found basically there were two main things going on. One is the actual electorate had a higher proportion of whites without a college degree than was assumed and weighted to in the by the pre-election polls in the states. And in addition to that, there were a larger number of undecided voters than there were in 2020, and they broke disproportionately for Trump. And that occurred in the last 3 days leading up to the election, and the polls couldn't really, the last couple of days leading up to the election, and the polls couldn't pick that kind of thing up. And then the other thing that was going on, which people missed, that the national polls were accurate because in the 3 days before the election, there were fully 11 national polls, most of them done, or at least many of them done by the best polling organizations. In the states, there were about half that number, or even fewer, in the last week leading up to the election. And those weren't exactly the A team of the polling organizations. This time around, when I took a look at it today, it looks as though there were maybe about 10 national polls that were done in the 3 days before the election. And then at the state level, there were on the order of about 6 or so, or maybe even more within the last 3 days. So there actually were better polling data there. the big question is to what extent did they actually, compensate or statistically weight to the right number based on the proportion, their estimated proportion of whites without a college degree. We won't know for sure until we see the exit poll data and find out what the composition of the electorate was, or the census, post-election census survey that gets done. But what it looks like, and at least we have one case, the Florida election was predicted to be very close, and it's turned out to be very close. So in the case of the currently competitive states, it's so far so good. And we'll have to see what else happens with these results.
When you say that it's predicted to be close, so 538 as well as Andy Gelman's work at The Economist had Biden winning Florida by, the odds of Biden winning Florida were much larger than the odds of Trump winning Florida.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a very good point. And the one cautionary note there is part of that's a function of what polling data they include in their weighting and their averaging and modeling. And there's a real difference. I don't know what Andy Gelman does, but I just noticed it today. There's a real difference between 538 and Real Clear Politics. And I don't know who's right and who's wrong here. But Real Clear Politics includes Trafalgar and a lot of these other polls that have been outliers. And in terms of why they're outliers, the only thing I don't know, they don't say exactly what they do. And what they could do is actually make up numbers for all we know, because we have no way of checking on this. But what they could be doing is statistically weighting on what they think the partisanship is going to be of the electorate. And that's different from weighting on the another demographic. And it may be just good guesswork, and but Real Clear Politics is averaging that in, and so their average turns out to be a smaller difference. And Real Clear Politics doesn't come up with a probability; they just tell you what the average difference is, and that could be it. I don't know.
There was a Twitter controversy today about Real Clear Politics and how they're cutting off the polls that they're including in their poll aggregation. And the claim was that it basically was making the odds look a lot better for Trump and in the way they were being selective, as well as including things.
Oh yeah, I agree. Whatever they're doing, their numbers look a little better for Trump.
Yeah,
their numbers look a little better. And the one thing, just the subtext here is that the founder of Real Clear Politics is a conservative.
Yeah.
Okay, so but if you look at what Real Clear Politics posts and it publishes a whole wide range of things, so it's hard to tell. And it's actually a good site for articles and commentary and things.
Yeah. Nate Silver also a week ago he showed some evidence that that Republican partisans were picking up the phone were answering the phone to pollsters at a lower rate. Is that a real concern? Does
Yes.
that just correlates all the errors across states? Is that
that's a real concern. And that figures into weighting by party identification. And Andy Gelman's written on this. That is from poll to poll. You get a different composition of partisanship in the polls, and a lot depends on things and how well the president's doing and whether the Republicans want to talk to pollsters. And so you worry about that kind of non-response bias,
mm-hmm.
which you can't fully pick up by waiting for education and race, or even geography, which comes into play. Because the relevant geography is rural areas and small towns, and in particular in the Midwest areas that we're going to be, watching very closely soon.
So the final verdict on polling.
That
was the question.
My final.
Do we like polling?
Well, I say yes, only because we can figure out what's going on and possibly improve it. Of course, that's pretty self-serving since I'm actively engaged in that, and it's literally a bread and butter issue for me.
I think the moral of the question actually splits in two things. One is there a problem with the statistical methodology of polling? But probably it's the real problem is the way that the public interprets and ingests. When we say that Trump has a 30% chance, what does that mean? How do people interpret that? And I think probably there's a real systematic problem there, right? With what it means to have a 70% chance in a model and how that gets communicated.
Yeah, I mean, Nate Silver has been kind of pounding the table and trying to educate people on that. But this is a pretty old issue. It turns out it first came up in an academic way after the 1948 election, when the pollsters predicted that Thomas Dewey would beat Harry Truman. And there was a big uproar, and the uproar led to a Social Science Research Council report, which actually is available online. If you Googled SSRC report 1948, Frederick Mosteller, famous statistician who did.
Mosteller and Wallace.
Pardon?
Mosteller and Wallace.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I went to graduate school with his daughter in public policy way back when. Anyway, in any case, he headed the commission, and also the other person on the committee, I think David Truman was on it, who's a political scientist, the former president of Columbia, and so forth. And they talked about the problem in those polls was that the pollsters were pretty arrogant. They stopped polling a few weeks early. They thought the election was over by election day, all kinds of things. And also it turned out the interviewers had too much discretion in filling their quotas. They could pick who they wanted to fill out their quotas, and they tended to pick upscale people, and you had a Republican bias. But one point they make in the report is that people don't understand probabilities. And that came in, and so this is we didn't just discover that today. It's been around for a while.
One other point I'll throw out is this may be a little off the track, but I have a friend who's a pollster, and he's worked for some major polling firms in DC, and we were talking today about our expectations, about things that surprises that might happen, and he thinks that so there are a lot of polls that we never get to see, right? I would say we probably actually get to see. I don't know what the percentage is, but I think it's actually a pretty small percentage of polls that are done, because pretty much every both presidential candidates, House candidates, Senate candidates, they're all doing their own polling, right? And they're doing tracking polls. These are they have polls out in the field every day, but we really don't. Hardly ever get to see those. They're proprietary, right? We don't get to see them, especially we don't get to see them during the campaign. And if what we do get to see, it's selective releases, right? So either polling that makes them look good and invulnerable, or that makes them look like it's a close race and they're trying to get more more donors to contribute money to them. So my friend has a hypothesis that basically all this behind the scenes polling is making it harder for the kind of polling that we do get to see, because with the partisan sorting that has happened in this country, where voters are pretty much ideologically in step with the parties that they identify with, and the parties are very polarized. And so all this polling that goes on behind the scenes that we don't get to see is basically making it inevitable that we're going to have really close races, which makes it harder to make these kinds of predictions. And so I don't know if there's this is his anecdotal his anecdotal evidence for this hypothesis, but I think there might be something there. I mean, something is definitely happening where I'd be curious to know systematically what the data would look like. But it certainly, I mean, at the presidential level, we've had much closer elections than we've had in any time in recent memory, right? It's also happening at the congressional level, right? You have elections that are decided by a few hundred votes. We had a presidential election that was basically decided by a few hundred votes. Last presidential election was decided, to put a number on it, like about 77,000 votes, right? So very close elections. And so I think it's probably worth looking into what polling is doing in terms of deciding how resources are going to be allocated by campaigns, how money is going to be allocated, how money is raised and spread around the country, and what role that is playing in making races close, which are much harder to predict now.
Yes, some very great insight into polls as well as like the probability and statistics. Transitioning into gerrymandering, people are wondering, gerrymandering is often considered something that puts Republicans at an unfair advantage in states and districts. Do you think this will impact the 2020 presidential election, and will Trump somehow blame gerrymandering if he loses? Do you think that the GOP has taken advantage of their majority in the last 4 years to enforce gerrymandering across the nation? Love to hear your thoughts.
Well, gerrymandering shouldn't affect the presidential election because of the way votes are counted. They're not, so gerrymandering, or especially partisan gerrymanders, they're meant to give one party an advantage in the way that district lines are manipulated, but that shouldn't have any role in the presidential election because it's just the state total, except for Maine and Nebraska, determines the electoral college votes that each candidate gets. I do think partisan gerrymandering is something to keep an eye on at the state level because we do have not many people have been talking about the state elections. Everybody's been focused on the presidential race, but there are a lot of state elections. This is a census year, which means that if depending on who comes out on top in a lot of these state level races, they'll control what the congressional districts are going to look like. The Supreme Court this past term decided that partisan gerrymandering is not something that the federal courts can weigh in on. So that more or less gives, in those states where the state legislatures draw the lines, that pretty much gives them a blank check to manipulate the districts any way they want. It'll be curious to see, and that, for the most part, that in recent years, it's been Republicans have been using partisan gerrymandering to their advantage, especially in places like Wisconsin, although places like North Carolina and Pennsylvania, lower state courts have overturned partisan gerrymanders. So we'll have. I don't think we've heard the last of this. Especially if be curious to see if Democrats win a lot of these state legislatures and draw the lines to favor them, whether or not Republicans will now come out against partisan gerrymandering and try to seek resolution through the courts. So I think it's a very important issue, and although I don't think it matters much for the presidential election, but it does matter for lots of elections that we're not talking much about currently.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry.
Just as a secondary, I mean, it doesn't affect gerrymandering. Won't affect how exactly the votes cast for president are counted, but it could have a secondary effect in terms of the legislatures that write the state laws about how votes are collected for the presidential race. Those legislatures, if they are in power due to partisan gerrymandering, they may be passing all sorts of laws to limit. It could have a very secondary effect on the presidential election, right? I'm not sure if we see any evidence of that in 2020, but there was also,
and they obviously have a direct effect on translating votes into seats in congressional elections and state legislative elections. I mean, one party can get a noticeable majority of the aggregate party vote, but wind up with a smaller proportion of seats than that proportion of votes would dictate.
That's Wisconsin.
Yes, yes.
In a big way.
Wisconsin. Big way, yeah. No, there's some outrageous cases of this.
All right. Well, kind of finally switching gears to, I guess, the biggest question on everyone's minds right now. I know I was definitely glued to my TV before this, but kind of what are y'all thinking about the election results so far today? What states are you kind of paying attention to? Who do you see like winning in those battleground states? Are you expecting any surprise upheaval so far in non-swing states? Kind of what are the thoughts, at 9:30 on election night?
I'm staring at the latest results on the TV. One of the big questions was, especially given the projections by 538 and The Economist and others, whether or not this would be a real Democratic landslide. And Florida becomes pretty key in getting a sense of whether it might be, because it was one of the first states. It's the first state, I think, to come close to counting all its votes, and it's very, very close there. It doesn't look like Biden's going to win at the moment, and so that puts a little bit of a damper on the landslide. On the other hand, the other states in play are pretty impressive at the moment. I mean, Texas looks close. The one surprise that's just come up, and it was maybe predicted by Sherrod Brown when he was interviewed yesterday. He said Ohio. He thought Ohio was going to go Democratic, and Biden has a lead there right now, and that would be a surprise, and that would foreshadow Biden doing well in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, given the composition of the state. So I would watch that one at the moment. Georgia doesn't look like it's coming through at the moment. And then the other wild card question is Arizona. But in the end, it could just come down to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that Hillary Clinton lost by, under 90,000 votes, maybe 77,000 votes, and I would, I predicted way back when, going into 2008, the 2018 election, that I thought Trump would not be able to hold on to those three states, and that would be decisive at the end, and that may still be the case, and we'll know more, and we'll know more by tonight, and we'll have to see.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on in Florida. They've been stuck at about 93% of the vote counted, according to the New York Times website for a while now. And Trump is up by three percentage points, but I'm not. I guess I could. I'm too tired to do the math on this, but if you look at the counties that are reporting, they're clearly the big counties are going for Biden, right? And the smaller counties are going for Trump. And so maybe that adds up, but it's just striking to see, like, some of these counties, how few people live in them.
Yes.
Right. So I'm looking at Taylor County, which has only about 10,000 voters, or 10,000 votes reported. That's 98%. The estimated votes reported, whereas you have, Miami, down in Miami-Dade County, that's like 1.1 million voters, and they have 95% of the estimated votes reported. So I'm curious to know whether Biden can make up those 3 percentage points. Just if you have that, you still have like 5% of the vote out in Miami-Dade and 8% vote out in West Palm. That sounds like that's a lot of votes. Right. So I don't know that this is just looking at Trump being ahead by 51% with 93% of the estimated votes reported is really that informative. I mean, it's informative, but I don't know that, I'm curious to see what's happening here. It's just really interesting to look at the political geography here. It's also true for many parts of the country where you see these counties that go strongly for one candidate versus the other, but yet there's just hardly any people who live there, and like 10,000 people compared to 1.1 million people in a county, right? And just like how these smaller counties can really add up to give a victory to a candidate when the other candidate is winning these major metropolitan areas. Pennsylvania, I think I totally agree with Bob. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, it's really that's Trump's wall right there. If he doesn't win them, I don't those states, I don't see how he can win. If he only needs one. Ohio, I'm sorry,
Trump only needs one of, everything being equal to 2016, he only needs one of the states.
Yeah, it's surprising that Trump could lose Pennsylvania and still win the Electoral College. That's really that was sobering to me when I saw some of the I think it was the New York Times had different scenarios you could choose, and for Biden to win Pennsylvania but not win. When was the last time that a presidential candidate did not win Pennsylvania but yet won a majority in the Electoral College vote? I don't know. It's certainly not in my lifetime, I don't think.
Yeah.
Texas seems to be the biggest surprise at this moment, right?
Yeah.
When was the last time Texas was this close?
Well, it was in the 2018 Senate race.
Senate race.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, not presidential, but yeah,
Right.
but I think that's a it's a harbinger of what's happening in Texas. Like for Beto O'Rourke to make it so close, right? An incumbent senator, a pretty well liked incumbent senator, at least by his partisans, co-partisans, to come that close to defeat in the state of Texas. But I don't know. We'll see. Still a lot of counties are out in Texas, and they're all, they look to me like there are going to be a lot of rural counties to come in, and so it might be the same deal where Trump makes up the his deficit in the urban regions by getting all these, winning big in the rural regions.
Yes, so it's definitely like Pennsylvania and Texas and other states like that we're paying attention to. And, Biden's not looking good at the moment, but it's still pretty close. So now it's about 9:40. We just want to open it up to audience questions. So you can either raise hand or type it in the chat and I'll read it out for you. So what questions do you guys have for our speakers?
Hi. I just want to say thank you for the great event so far. I was just wondering, I've been watching CNN this whole time, and the CNN analyst, while he was covering Florida a lot in the beginning, said that the Hispanic vote in like Miami-Dade area has gone from 62% in 2016 to about 50% this time. So I was just wondering if you guys had any idea about why that would be, that it changed so much.
Meaning support for Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, Bob. I don't know if you're aware of any polling.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah. Well, what the discussion has been about is the extent that Trump has, campaigned there. But you have to keep in mind, Latinos in Florida are different in the sense that they have been historically more Cuban than either Puerto Rican or Mexican, which are the other predominant Latino groups. And now you've had an influx of additional Puerto Ricans because of the hurricane, but in addition you've got Venezuelans and Colombians there as well. And what resonates with them, well, there may be certain aspects of Trump's character that could resonate with them, especially Latino men, but but what has resonance when Trump talks about socialism and Marxism and that kind of thing, that those ideological references don't ring well with them, accusing Biden to being too left leaning in orientation, and that's the pitch that's been made, and that's what the pundits have been speculating about. But it's clearly, demographically, it's a different segment of the Latino population, which is just different when it comes to voting. It's not so different when it comes to opinions on various political issues, but it does have to do with voting and the U.S. opposition to authoritarian leftist regimes in Cuba and now Venezuela.
I think there's maybe an open question because I think the Cuban constituency in Florida are historically Republican, predominantly Republican. So I think it's an open question why there's this big shift in this election, right, towards Trump. Maybe it's just him campaigning in Florida.
Well, but he's also taken a different position toward Cuba than Obama did, and so that's changed. That's changed.
Yes.
I wonder how much of it might also just be incumbency, right? Incumbent presidents have there is an incumbency advantage when it comes to the presidency. There have only been 2 presidents since 1976 who incumbent. Well, I don't know if you can count Ford as an incumbent president, but basically, Jimmy Carter and George Herbert Walker Bush are the only presidents who were one-termers, right? Who ran for re-election and did win. I mean, Ford kind of that's a special case. But for the most part, when incumbent presidents run for re-election, and they almost always do, the only president in the post-World War II period who has not run for re-election is Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1968. And when presidents run, and they almost always do, they almost always win. And so there's got to be something going on in terms of individual level voters and certain demographic groups that they support, and they support the incumbent. I think something is going on. Something's going on there that maybe that's got something to do with it. That the American electorate seems to be reluctant to turn an incumbent president out of office. And I do think that it's a massive if, but if coronavirus hadn't hit, I think Donald Trump basically would pretty much be coasting to re-election right now.
Yes, definitely great points. We have a question from Natasha, and she asks, I have a lot of friends who registered to vote in the state where they attend college. How big of an impact can college students voting in swing states like Florida and Pennsylvania have?
Well, I think in those states, given close elections, every vote counts. And if a college student, if a student were attending Columbia University, and the student was from Florida, and they had a choice of registering in New York to vote versus registering to vote rather than voting in Florida, their vote would count more in Florida, given the nature of party competition in the two states. So I think it's significant, especially when you're talking possibly about big state universities, where there are a lot of students. It can matter quite a bit.
All right, so we've got a question from Amir. I'm just going to ask him to unmute.
Hi, so thank you again for all three of you for coming to speak today. I'm just curious, and this might touch more on the polling question from earlier, but obviously as we saw in 2016, as the public saw, from the public's point of view, there was a massive disrupt in terms of what was expected from polling and what happened. And I think that led to a kind of distrust in experts, especially statisticians and political scientists. And so as statisticians and political scientists yourselves, I'm curious in how you view kind of winning back the trust of the public, or perhaps we're misreading it, and where that's not necessarily the goal of your profession is to have this kind of relationship with the public view or non-academics.
I think the academic view is to do what one can to get things scientifically or social scientifically right. And the real problem was that the public's expectations, given what was said about what the state polling led pundits to predict, where pundits and statisticians predict. Nate Silver and many others made the same kind of prediction, but the prediction was made in probabilistic terms, and a 70% probability is not certainty. But if you keep saying 70%, 70%, 70% over and over again, it begins to sound much more certain. So part of it has to do with basically getting the message across that these things are probabilistic. And 70% means if you make the same guess in 3 elections, you're going to be off once, and that has to kind of sink in. Think about playing Russian roulette with a pistol that can hold 3 bullets, and you put one bullet into it, so to speak. But the other part is that one thing that didn't happen is that it didn't affect the continuing use and conducting of public opinion surveys, including those in the press. Polling results still get reported as much as they've ever gotten before. In fact, now leading to this election, even more so. And of course, now all the prognosticators are maybe taking a risk. But at least this go round, they've tried to be. I think they've tried to be a little bit more cautious and trying to get the word out what probabilities mean. And but a lot will depend on how the polls how these predictions perform in the current election. If it turns out that Biden doesn't get the nomination, it really suggests the lessons weren't necessarily fully learned from 2016, and you may still have a certain arrogance on the part of these statisticians who make these kinds of predictions.
Yeah, but I think also it's like I think it's unfortunate that the focus is so much on the horse race aspect. I mean, what we do as social scientists is try to understand why things are happening the way they are, not necessarily. And you can, if you understand them well enough, then you can produce effective forecasts. But when you're, I think our job is basically to figure out what are the dynamics that are causing the results that we're seeing. And so there's, I think that the polls, so everybody talks about poll numbers, and I think websites like 538 have become much more popular, but I don't know that literacy about what they're actually doing has improved. I think it's improved some, but not to the extent that people make judgments that I think that are inappropriate, right? So when you say there's a 30% chance of rain and it rains, you're not wrong, right? So that's basically what happened in 2016. 538 basically said, I forget what the final number was, somewhere around 30%. 30% of elections, you run them, Trump wins, right? And so that's what happened. And it was the election was basically a coin flip when it really comes down to it. Like, it was decided, ignoring correlation among states. It basically was like 0.001% of the vote decided the election, and those in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So I think that for me, there's more interesting dynamics that are going on than just that we want to and I don't think, I'm not saying that we that we have a better handle on that, but I do think that we do on producing poll numbers. But at the same time, I think that's for at least from a social science perspective, that's the thing that's more important to focus on, rather than doing poll aggregation. I think poll aggregation is interesting, and I think it's worth doing, but at the same time, is that ultimately where the focus should be? I think that Donald Trump's election signifies deeper issues that are going on in the American electorate that we really didn't understand. And so as a social scientist, I'd much rather than figure out why he won by the margin that he did, or why the polls were wrong, trying to figure out what the underlying dynamics that would lead to his election. And basically, here's a candidate who broke norms that we thought were unbreakable, right? And would be fatal to a candidate's survival. But he got through a primary, he got through the general, and then he's continued to stayed in character basically through the first 4 years of his administration. And that to me is the more interesting stuff about how somebody could go against the grain so often and still end up where he is.
Yeah, the question was how can the public trust pollsters again? And there's a lot of interesting methodological questions. I do think there are still some deep problems with polling methodology, namely that the models that we use to predict each election, they get tweaked and tailored such that it's never the same model that's predicting every election, right? So each model tends to make one prediction in the end, or maybe 50 if you count all states. And the usual way that you calibrate these things is you say, if a certain model gives 1,000 predictions, they're all probabilities, you can go ahead and you can ask, how many times did an event happen that this model predicted 30%, right? And if it actually happens 30% of the time, the model is well calibrated. But in this scenario, it sort of looks like each round we kind of change the model. And so we don't get the chance to actually calibrate any individual model in the same way. And so, I mean, in the most pessimistic version of this, we are trying to calibrate a new model every time, against a single non-repeatable event. And that's potentially a big problem, right? I mean, I don't think it's that big of a problem, but it's possible there's a really deep methodological problem. In terms of the trust thing, maybe we shouldn't, maybe the public should not be trusting pollsters. Maybe the horse race really shouldn't be a big part of the coverage, right? I mean, I don't know what value it has exactly. And there's research that shows that it depresses turnout, that at least in 2016, people that were following the horse race and really thought that the polls showed that Clinton was going to win, they didn't turn up. And it was, and there's research that is suggestive, it's sort of loose, but it's suggestive that that reading the polls actually changed the outcome. So I don't know, maybe pollsters shouldn't be redeemed. Maybe that just shouldn't be a part of the, maybe there shouldn't be a ticker, right?
Well, of course, the reason that those kinds of polls are done and reported on is basically there's a market for it. That is, the public is interested in. It's curious.
Right.
This goes back to the origin of the old straw polls in the 19th century. People wanted to know what other people thought, particularly in the context of an election. And people may complain about the horse race, but it still seems to sell commercial time on network television.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So then, I think we have time for one more question. I think John has a question, so I'll ask you to unmute right now. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you to all our professors for coming out. I thought it was really great. I wanted to touch on a comment Professor Wara made earlier on like the likelihood of Donald Trump winning this election if it weren't for the coronavirus. You said that he would probably be coasting to victory. I see that as likely given the strong economic numbers, and I wanted to ask the other panelists as well what you thought about that, and I guess what you thought about the chances of Donald Trump winning if it weren't for this pandemic.
Well, I agree with Professor Wara, and the reason being is that Trump could have run. Trump's campaign would be very different. He would be emphasizing all of his accomplishments, which he's done, but he's been more. He's had to deal with the coronavirus in a different way, in a very combative kind of way. I mean, there's a scenario on which he could have actually handled that in a much more statesman-like way and used it to his advantage if he acted more presidential. That's a whole other spiel to go over and sort of goes against the grain given his psychological profile. But basically, he could run on his record of accomplishments. Tax reform, deregulation, appointment of judges, dismantling other things that Obama's done, and the crown jewel was the economy. The crown that was really it. A historically low unemployment rate, even though GDP was a little more sluggish than he would have liked, and of course the stock market was soaring, and he could point to that as well. And without that, he would be vulnerable to a lot less criticism, and he would be the kinds of things he would be criticizing for. It would be his personal style, that he's a despicable person, and so forth. And they were talking about involvement with the Russians, the Mueller report, impeachment, and all that kind of stuff. But that really hasn't been those issues are just much weaker issues than running on a mishandled pandemic and a slumping economy.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, it looks like we're down to the last couple minutes. First off, I just want to thank our speakers for being here and telling us so many great and informative details about this election. It's certainly an exciting and historic night. Lastly, so first off, and also thank you all for joining us for this event. And then lastly, our president, Arya, just has one other event that she wants to mention that might be of interest.
Yeah, thank you, Hiba and Kanab, for moderating. Thank you, professors, for joining us tonight. This has been a really great event, and thank you all for coming. I'm excited to see you all here, and I know we're all stressing about the election, so it's good to do that together. I wanted to bring up another event that CUSJ is hosting at the end of November, November 21st. We're hosting the National Undergraduate on Scientific Journalism, which will be a place for a lot of tangential conversations similar to the ones we had tonight about scientific misinformation, how scientific data can be interpreted appropriately, and that kind of thing. If you're interested, I'm going to put the link for registration and schedule in the chat, so I encourage you to check that out. Once again, thank you all for coming tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at future CUSJ events.
Thank you,
everyone.
Bye.
Be safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dude, someone joined the meeting room at like 6:57.
Yes, I
I
saw
was
that. I let them in, but I was like,
I hope they didn't miss it because of time zones or something. Hmm.
that was so good. I couldn't really pay attention to what they were saying.